Today you're going to need some watercolor paper, like this watercolor pad, a cup of water to clean your brushes and to activate the paint. You will also need a paper towel to help clean your brushes, and of course your watercolor paints, and also a brush to paint with watercolors. Try to make sure it's fairly soft so it can absorb water and paint. Today the techniques that we're going to go over is wet on wet, wet on dry, also how to save whites. Now what you need to do is get your watercolor tray and you want to activate the paint that's in there. Usually it's pretty dry, and to do that you want to get your brush kind of wet, and you just need to put a little bit of water on the color that you're going to use right away. Do not put water on all of the colors because you're not going to use all the colors right away, and that will kind of ruin your colors when it evaporates. So here we're going to do a little bit of wet on wet. You can use your brush with only water to get the area you're going to paint wet. In this instance, I'm going to use a sponge that I cut up, and I'm just going to get an area wet just with water and water only. And you can really only do this with watercolor paper. If you try with regular copy paper, it can ruin that. And what I'm going to do here is, with my brush, I'm going to choose a color, and I'm just going to spread it out on one corner. And wet on wet, it's a lot easier to spread out the color because the pigment from the watercolor spreads out easily. Now I'm using a different color. Make sure you clean your brush every time. You don't want to have one color on your brush and then immediately go into another one. That will mess up your watercolor paints. And now here we're going to do some wet on dry. Pretty much I'm just using the paint and putting it straight on the paper. I didn't get that section wet at all, hence wet on dry. And later on you'll see that there is a difference between painting with wet on wet and wet on dry. And another technique that you can do is called jeweling. Basically, you can use either wet on wet or wet on dry to do this. What you're going to do is you're going to paint an area and make sure you get the area that you want with all, full of color. Clean your brush, get a different color, and you're just going to put little dots in that area when it's still wet. And if you notice, those dots spread out just a little bit, and depending on the size of the dots depends on how much they spread. You can also do this with wet on wet. Again, I'm using the sponge, just getting an area wet first. Then I'm going to choose my color. I'm going to paint in the area that's wet. Make sure I cover the whole area. And then I'm going to do the same thing with a different color. Just putting in little dots and they kind of spread out. That's jeweling. Now I wanted to show you how to save whites, and there I used Elmer's glue and rubber cement. You can also use Scotch tape or painter's tape for areas that you want to keep white, because in watercolors you really don't have a white. to make sure that you have white on your paper after you're painting, what's called saving whites. Now, while those are still drying, I'm just going to paint this tree. You want to do it in sections. Right now, I'm just painting in the sky. If I were to be impatient while the sky was still wet and I painted in the top of the tree and the trunk, the colors would bleed into each other, and sometimes that can be a big mess. So you want to paint it in sections. Now, while I'm waiting for the sky to dry, I'm just taking some colors and painting over some of the dried areas on the wet on dry. And as you notice that when you do that, some of the colors do tend to change. Now here I'm going to show you when you paint in two different areas and both sides are still wet. You'll kind of see what happens to each other. They kind of bleed into each other and you kind of get muddy colors in between. Now, some instances that may look good, but knowing some of you, when it looks dirty and muddy, you'll hate your painting. And now that the glue has seemed to dry enough, I'm going to go ahead and paint over that. I'm just choosing a color, painting over the rubber cement area. And now while that paint is drying, I'm just going to go ahead and continue with the tree. I painted the top part of the sky. Now I'm working on the trunk. Now I'm going to use this bigger brush later for the top of the tree, but I'm going to use this small brush to add more values to the tree, add a little bit of texture. And when you want to darken in some values, you want to have more paint on your brush than water. So try to control how much water you put on your brush. Now I'm painting the tops of the tree, adding different values. Again, more paint than water will give you some darker values. And also I will use some blacks for under the tree and part of the shadow of the tree, which you'll see here momentarily. Now while all that is drying, I want to paint this person that I drew. Same thing, you want to paint in sections, and you want to give the areas that you paint some time to dry. You'll notice that I will start light in pretty much the whole face, and then in other parts I will add more paint to add more values, darker values, kind of like shadows and such. But again, with this, even it's sped up, I still took the time, waited for parts to dry before I moved to a different section. So you need to keep that in mind. Don't just get impatient and start painting everything all at once, because when you do that, your paints will kind of get muddied. They will bleed into each other, and your painting won't look as good as it could if you showed a little bit of patience and let some areas dry before you start painting in with a different color or different paint. So here I'm just painting in the different features. I'll be adding a few more different values. You can think of them as shadows, just parts of the head that the value is a little bit darker. You don't have to always draw everything out, especially when you're painting. Everything is mostly one edge of a color or paint touching another edge. You don't really want to see a whole lot of lines. So I'm just going to keep working on this person for a little bit. And I'm even using a Sharpie marker to outline certain areas. Again, my suggestion is wait for the paint to dry, because if the paint's still wet, the Sharpie won't work as well. And I'm still continuing to add different values. The forehead got a little too dark, so I used the sponge to pick up some of the color. And add a little bit of color to his lips. Now it's time to review some of the techniques that I went over with y'all. This is what they look like. Wet on wet, wet on dry, also the jeweling technique, and the saving whites. Now, what I did was peel away the rubber cement, and some areas I don't think I put enough on. You want to put a good amount on if you want to make sure the area stays white. The Elmer's glue, you just need to let that dry completely. And this is the tree and the person that I painted. And I hope you guys practice these techniques that we went over and turn them into Google Classroom.